the world's highest security prison, CECOT, where the most evil are kept. The shocking beginning. Inside the heart of El Salvador, under blazing spotlights and thick concrete walls, sits a place unlike any other. Thousands of men, tattooed from head to toe, their eyes burning with rage, were dragged into a brand new prison built only for them. This was not just another jail. This was a fortress designed to hold the most feared gang leaders in the world. Imagine this: shackled men shuffling in long lines, heads bowed, surrounded by soldiers with rifles ready to fire at the smallest wrong move. They are thrown onto the ground, packed shoulder to shoulder, their arms chained behind them, their entire bodies pressed against each other. They are told they will never again see sunlight like before. This was the moment the world first saw the inside of CECOT, El Salvador's Terrorism Confinement Center. A prison so secure, the government claimed not a single soul could ever escape. A prison built to hold the most dangerous gangsters alive, men who once controlled entire neighborhoods through fear and death. But how did we get here? How did El Salvador build what many call the world's highest security prison? And what is life truly like behind those concrete walls? Stay with me, because the story only gets darker. The birth of a monster prison. To understand CECOT, you have to know what came before. For decades, El Salvador was under siege by two of the most feared gangs in the Americas, MS-13 and Barrio 18. Their names were whispered in fear across Central America, the United States, and beyond. These gangs ruled entire cities. They charged families rent just to live in their own homes. Buses were burned if drivers refused to pay. And those who resisted often disappeared, never to be seen again. Murders skyrocketed, and for years, El Salvador was known as one of the most dangerous countries in the world. Then came the turning point. In March 2022, one weekend alone saw over 80 people murdered in the streets. It was a message from the gangs to the government: we still control this country. The president, Nayib Bukele, answered with an iron fist. He declared a state of exception, giving police and soldiers sweeping powers. Tens of thousands of suspected gang members were arrested in just months. Families watched as their sons, brothers, and fathers were dragged away. But there was a problem. Where do you put so many prisoners? El Salvador's prisons were already overflowing. Cells built for 20 people had 80 crammed inside. The solution was brutal, fast, and shocking: build the largest and most secure prison the world had ever seen. CECOT was born. The fortress. The construction of CECOT was like something out of a movie. Hidden deep in the countryside, far from cities, the prison was designed like a war base. 40 watchtowers line the walls. Concrete fences are stacked with electrified barbed wire. Every inch of the perimeter is covered with surveillance cameras. And outside, soldiers armed with machine guns stand ready to shoot anyone who dares approach. CECOT can hold up to 40,000 prisoners, making it one of the biggest prisons on Earth. But the inside is even more shocking. There are steel doors that weigh as much as a car. Cells with no windows, no natural light. Prisoners get no mattresses, no pillows, no privacy. Toilets are holes in the ground. Every hallway is controlled by electronic gates, and guards patrol with military weapons. The prison is designed so that inmates can't even whisper without cameras or microphones picking it up. Bukele himself said it proudly: these men will never again harm the honest people of this country. But while the government celebrated, human rights groups began to sound alarms. Was this really justice? Or was this a human experiment, locking away tens of thousands in conditions that could break any man? The arrival. The first day prisoners were transferred into CECOT became an unforgettable global moment. Videos were released to the public. Hundreds of gang members, heads shaved, tattoos crawling up their necks and faces, were paraded into the prison barefoot. They were forced to run, crouch, and crawl, lined up in military precision. Their arms locked tightly behind them as guards barked orders. The images shocked the world. Some cheered, calling it the end of gangs in El Salvador. Others were horrified, saying it looked more like a human warehouse than a prison. But for the inmates themselves, this was a nightmare. These were men who once controlled entire cities, now stripped of all power. No phones. No visits. No communication with the outside world. Not even a window to see the sun. Inside, whispers began to spread. This is not a prison. This is a tomb. And as the days went on, strange things started to happen inside the walls of CECOT, things that would test whether even the strongest men could survive here. Silence behind the bars. At first, the silence inside CECOT was unnatural. Imagine thousands of men who once shouted orders on the streets, now reduced to whispers, if they dared to speak at all. There were no visits from family. No phone calls. No letters. No sunlight. The walls of CECOT cut them off completely. The only sound was the echo of boots hitting the metal floors as guards patrolled. In other prisons, gangs had always found ways to communicate: smuggled cell phones, hidden notes, corrupt guards. But here, that was impossible. Every corner had cameras. Every guard was military trained. Even the food, served twice a day, came under such heavy control that nothing could be hidden inside. For a moment, it seemed like the gangs had been silenced. Murders on the outside dropped to levels no one had ever imagined possible in El Salvador. Families could finally ride buses without fear. Children could play in neighborhoods once ruled by gangs. But behind the walls, tension began to build. These were men used to violence, men who lived by fear and control. And in CECOT, that power had been stripped away. Something had to break. It started small, arguments over food rations. A prisoner pushed another aside in the line. Another demanded more space in the cramped cell. In a place designed to crush the human spirit, even the smallest disagreements felt explosive. One night, the silence finally shattered. Two inmates fought in the dark corner of their cell, their fists landing heavy thuds that echoed through the concrete. Guards rushed in with shields, dragging both men out by their chains. The message was clear: in CECOT, violence would be crushed instantly. But this only fueled the fire, because the gangs, even stripped of everything, still had pride. And pride in a cage can turn deadly. The breaking point. Weeks passed. Some inmates grew weaker, their bodies adjusting to smaller meals, no sunlight, and endless hours locked in cells. Others paced like caged animals, whispering in their gang's coded language whenever they thought the cameras weren't watching. Then came the breaking point. A group of prisoners tried to test the system. During the short daily movement from cells to a controlled yard, one inmate refused to kneel. It was a small act, but inside a place like CECOT, it was the spark of rebellion. Guards swarmed instantly. He was slammed to the ground, dragged across the floor, and left bruised and bloodied in front of the others. But instead of fear, it ignited something dangerous. Whispers spread like wildfire through the cell blocks. If one can stand, maybe we all can. The prison had been built to destroy unity, but for the gangs, unity was survival. And now, the idea of fighting back began to grow. The guards sensed it too. Security measures were tightened. Cells were searched twice a day. Prisoners were forced to strip and kneel before moving anywhere. Still, the tension refused to fade. Because the gangs were not just men, they were armies. Armies that had ruled cities. And now, trapped inside CECOT, they had nothing left to lose. One night, screams erupted from a far wing of the prison. A sudden clash, metal clanging against concrete, guards rushing in with batons, prisoners resisting with anything they could grab. It was short, but it was brutal. By morning, the cells were silent again. But the warning was clear: the gangs were not broken yet. They were waiting, watching, and planning. Whispers of escape. CECOT was supposed to be escape-proof. Every wall reinforced, every hallway locked behind steel gates, every guard armed. The president himself said, "No one will ever leave." But inside the cells, rumors began to spread. Some prisoners claimed they had found weak points in the system. A section of wall that seemed thinner. A schedule of guards that repeated. A tunnel idea, whispered from cell to cell. Of course, whether these were real plans or just desperate dreams, no one knew. But hope, even false hope, can drive men to madness. A few tried small acts of defiance. Scratching into the concrete. Testing the strength of steel bars with their bare hands. trying to send messages by coughing in coded rhythms through the walls. Each time they were caught. Each time they were punished. Some were locked in solitary for days, left in pitch-black cells with no sound but their own heartbeat. Yet the whispers didn't die. They grew louder. And one night, in the dead silence of CECOT, a guard spotted movement on the cameras. 3 men, somehow out of formation, crouched together in a corner. He raised the alarm. The entire wing lit up with sirens. Guards stormed in, dragging the men away as the rest of the inmates pounded their fists on the walls, shouting for the first time in weeks. The prison didn't just hold criminals anymore. It held the seeds of rebellion. And as the outside world watched, a dangerous question hung in the air. What happens if the gangs inside CECOT find a way to rise again? The weight of darkness. Days turned into weeks. Inside CECOT, time no longer felt real. With no windows, no clocks, no sunlight, the prisoners lived in an endless loop of darkness and fluorescent light. Some men began to lose their minds. They talked to the walls, to shadows, to voices only they could hear. Others sat in silence, staring blankly ahead, refusing to eat. The prison was designed to break men, and slowly, it was working. But for gang leaders, showing weakness was not an option. Even locked away, they tried to project strength. They flexed during searches, glared at guards, and whispered commands to their followers. The guards, however, showed no fear. They treated every inmate the same. No special treatment, no exceptions. Even the most feared killers were stripped, shackled, and shoved into the same cold cells as everyone else. For a time, this created an uneasy calm. Inmates sat quietly, eating their meager meals, avoiding conflict. But like a storm building behind clouds, the silence only hid what was coming. Then one night, a man collapsed in his cell. His body, thin from weeks of poor food and no sunlight, gave out. Inmates shouted, banging on the doors for help. Guards arrived too late. The man lay lifeless, his tattoos stretching across skin that no longer moved. The silence broke. Inmates screamed, shaking the bars, yelling curses at the guards. It was the first death inside CECOT, and it lit a fire. The riot sparks. After the first death, the tension became unbearable. Guards could feel it. Every mealtime, eyes followed them with hate. Every shuffle of chains sounded sharper. The gangs had lost their power on the outside, but inside, they still had one weapon: numbers. Thousands of men, crammed together, angry and desperate. It started in the yard. A guard turned his back for just a second, and a prisoner lunged. A fist caught the guard's jaw. In seconds, chaos erupted. Dozens of inmates surged forward, using their bodies like weapons. The alarm screamed. Boots thundered through the hallways. Shields slammed into the mob. Batons cracked against skulls. Prisoners were thrown to the ground, pinned, shackled. It was over in minutes. But the damage was done. For the first time, CECOT had faced a coordinated outbreak of violence. The prison was locked down harder than ever. Meals were cut. Yard time was cancelled. Inmates were chained even inside their cells. But punishment couldn't erase what had just happened. The gangs had sent a message: we are still here. We can still fight. And the guards knew the next riot would be worse. Shadows of revenge. The riot forced the government to respond. President Bukele sent in more soldiers, surrounding CECOT with even heavier security. Helicopters circled above. Tanks rolled near the gates. The message to the world was clear: nothing would escape this fortress. But inside, the prisoners seethed. Their pride had been wounded, their unity tested. The gangs lived by one rule: never forget, never forgive. Revenge became their fuel. Some prisoners sharpened hidden objects against the concrete. Others plotted ways to strike at guards during searches. The prison staff grew harsher too. Cells were raided at dawn, men forced to strip and kneel in freezing air. The psychological war had begun. But then something unexpected happened. An older prisoner, once a feared leader, began to speak quietly in the cells. He told the younger men, "This place is not built for us to win with violence. Our fight must be smarter." It was a chilling reminder that even broken, the gangs could adapt. They didn't need weapons. They didn't need freedom. All they needed was patience. And as the guards tightened their grip, whispers of something bigger began to spread, something planned, something dangerous. One morning, during a routine head count, a guard noticed it. 3 inmates were missing. The alarm exploded. The vanishing. CECOT was supposed to be airtight. Every cell counted, every hallway monitored, every door locked with steel. But that morning, during routine checks, 3 names didn't answer roll call. At first, the guards thought it was a mistake. Maybe the men were in the infirmary. Maybe they had been moved. But after hours of searching, panic began to spread. 3 inmates were gone. How was it possible? There were no tunnels. No outside contact. No chance to slip through the gates. Yet the cells were empty. The news reached the highest levels of government. Bukele himself demanded answers. Soldiers stormed the prison, tearing apart every cell, checking every inch of concrete, every pipe, every vent. Finally, the truth was found. The men hadn't escaped CECOT, they had vanished inside it. Hidden beneath a pile of thin blankets, curled into the darkest corner of a cell, the men were discovered barely breathing. They hadn't broken free, they had tried to starve themselves to death. Their bodies were weak, their skin pale, their eyes empty. It wasn't an escape in the traditional sense, but it was an escape all the same, an escape from a place they called hell on earth. The guards rushed them to the infirmary. Some survived. One didn't. And with that, another wave of fury swept through the prison. Inmates pounded the walls, chanting, screaming, howling like wolves in the night. For the first time, it felt like CECOT itself was alive, with rage. The crackdown. The government could not allow another sign of weakness. After the attempted escape, Bukele ordered the prison tightened even more. Meals were cut smaller. Lights stayed on all night. Cells were searched 3 times a day. The prisoners were forced to kneel for hours during surprise inspections, their heads down, hands chained. To the outside world, the government broadcasted these images proudly. They showed thousands of tattooed gangsters, kneeling in silence, stripped of all power. The message was clear: El Salvador had defeated its demons. But inside, the reality was darker. The gangs were not broken. They were simmering, waiting, surviving. Every act of cruelty only made their anger sharper. Every death only bound them closer. The guards whispered among themselves too. Some feared the silence more than the riots. Silence meant plotting. Silence meant waiting. And then came the night when the silence shattered once again. A guard making his usual patrol down a dim hallway suddenly froze. From inside a cell came a sound no one expected to hear: laughter. The laughter in the dark. The sound echoed down the corridor, deep, mocking laughter. Not one voice, but many. Inmates laughed together, loud and defiant. It wasn't joy. It was a weapon. The guards slammed open the cell doors, dragging men out, demanding answers. But the prisoners only smiled. For the first time, they weren't silent, they weren't broken. They were sending a message: we are still alive. You cannot crush us. The laughter spread. From one cell block to another. Men banged the walls, shouted, laughed until the concrete shook with sound. The guards tried to silence them with force, but the noise wouldn't stop. For hours, the prison roared like a beast refusing to die. By dawn, the laughter faded into whispers. But the damage was done. The world outside now wondered, if the gangs still had spirit in CECOT, what would happen if they found a way to organize again? The fortress had not destroyed them. It had only locked thousands of angry men together, with nothing left but time. And time, in a place like CECOT, is the most dangerous weapon of all. The gathering storm. The laughter had ended, but the echo lingered. Guards patrolled the halls with tighter grips on their rifles. Every clang of metal, every cough, every shuffle of chains sounded like a warning. Something was brewing. The gangs inside CECOT had always thrived on order. On the outside, they controlled entire communities with rules, codes, and punishments. Even in here, stripped of everything, they began to rebuild that structure, silently, carefully. Whispers traveled from cell to cell in ways the cameras couldn't catch. Patterns of coughs. taps against the walls. Even body movements during inspections carried hidden meanings. The guards thought they had broken communication, but the gangs were finding ways to speak again. And then it began. In one block, prisoners refused their meals. In another, they sat in complete silence during inspections. Small acts of rebellion, tiny sparks in a prison designed to smother fire. The officers dismissed it at first. But soon, the sparks began to connect. And then one morning, during yard movement, hundreds of inmates stood still. Not moving, not kneeling, just staring at the guards with dead eyes. The silence was louder than any riot. The storm was coming. The lockdown of lockdowns. CECOT was already the most secure prison in the world. But after the yard standoff, the government ordered what they called the lockdown of lockdowns. Yard time was permanently cut. Prisoners spent nearly 23.5 hours a day inside their cells. Food portions shrank even smaller. No one, not even infirmary patients, moved without full chains. The government released videos again. Tattooed men kneeling in silence, their eyes empty, their ribs beginning to show. Supporters around the world applauded, calling Bukele's system a miracle. But inside CECOT, things were reaching a breaking point. Men began scratching gang symbols into the walls with their nails, leaving marks of defiance. Others refused to sleep, standing for hours in eerie silence, eyes open, as if waiting for something. And then came the most chilling act yet. One morning, guards opened a cell and found an inmate lying motionless. But he hadn't died of hunger or illness. He had carved into his own skin with sharp fragments of metal, leaving behind words that shook everyone who saw them. "We are not finished." The uprising ignites. The writing was like gasoline on fire. Within days, coordinated unrest spread through the prison. Meals were thrown back at guards. Inmates pounded their fists on the steel doors in unison, shaking the corridors like an earthquake. The guards responded with shields, tear gas, and brute force. But the inmates didn't stop. For every man dragged out in chains, 10 more shouted louder. The gangs had found their weapon, unity. Even stripped of power, even crushed by chains, they still had numbers. Thousands of men bound by the same code, the same rage, the same hunger for revenge. And then, during one inspection, it finally erupted. A group of inmates lunged as the cell doors opened. They had sharpened toothbrushes, broken metal pieces, anything they could turn into blades. Guards were ambushed. Alarms screamed. Sirens wailed. The uprising had begun. Hell unleashed. The sirens blared across CECOT, red lights flashing through the endless gray corridors. Guards slammed metal gates shut, trying to contain the chaos, but the uprising spread faster than they could react. Prisoners roared like wild animals, fists pounding against steel, bodies slamming against doors. In one block, inmates hurled their food trays at the cameras. In another, men ripped apart thin mattresses and stuffed them into toilets, flooding entire wings with dirty water. The guards fought back with shields, tear gas, and rubber bullets. Boots thundered on the concrete floors as riot squads swarmed cell blocks, slamming prisoners down one by one. But for the first time since CECOT opened, the balance shifted. Guards were outnumbered. Thousands of men against hundreds of soldiers. The gangs had nothing to lose, and in their rage, they felt untouchable. Shouts of "La Vive" echoed from one side, answered by "Barrio" from the other. Rivals on the streets, united now against their captors. Blood streaked across the floors. Smoke stung the air. The fortress of silence had become a battlefield. And yet, through the chaos, something terrifying emerged: coordination. The inmates weren't just lashing out blindly. They were moving in waves, following hidden commands, as if someone was leading them. The gangs had found a way to organize again. Fire and steel. The uprising raged for hours. Cameras caught images that shocked the world. Hundreds of tattooed men chanting together, guards dragging bodies through smoke-filled hallways, soldiers firing warning shots into the air. The government responded with overwhelming force. Military trucks surrounded the compound. Helicopters circled overhead. Floodlights lit the night sky as if it were day. Inside, the prison became a war zone. Tear gas canisters hissed through the air, choking the inmates. Riot squads stormed cell blocks, shields crashing, batons swinging. Still, the gangs refused to kneel. They used their chains as weapons, swinging them at guards. Some hurled makeshift spears made from broken pipes. Others simply threw themselves at the soldiers, bodies colliding with steel shields. By dawn, the uprising was crushed, but at a devastating cost. Dozens lay injured. Blood stained the concrete. Silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of control. It was the silence after a storm, heavy and dangerous. CECOT had survived its first true test. But it was clear, the gangs had not been destroyed. They had only been pushed deeper into their fury. The government wasted no time. Bukele appeared on national television, calm but firm. He declared the riot a failure. He promised the people that not one gang member would ever walk free again. CECOT was locked down even harder. Prisoners were denied yard time completely. Meals were cut to the bare minimum. Lights burned 24/7, so inmates could never sleep in darkness. But deep inside the cells, where no cameras could reach, whispers spread once again. The uprising may have failed, but it had proven something. Even the world's highest security prison could bleed. The gangs had tasted unity again. They had tested the system and survived. And for them, survival was enough to plan for the next strike. The fortress still stood. The walls were unbroken. But behind those walls, thousands of the world's most dangerous men were waiting. Waiting for another chance to rise. The pressure cooker. After the riot, CECOT changed forever. The prison didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like a ticking bomb. The guards walked the halls with heavier steps. Their eyes darted at every sound. A cough, a chain rattling, a whisper through the walls. They had survived one uprising, but they knew, if it happened once, it could happen again. Inside the cells, the inmates were restless. The uprising had been crushed, but it left them with something new, hope. Hope that they could still resist. Hope that they could still make the walls tremble. The atmosphere became unbearable. Meals were thrown silently into cells. Showers were cut shorter. Movement was reduced to almost nothing. But in the silence, paranoia grew. Guards whispered to each other that the gangs were plotting again. Inmates whispered to each other that the guards were preparing to starve them. Nobody trusted anyone. CECOT was supposed to be unbreakable. Instead, it had become a pressure cooker, steam building, waiting to explode. And then, something happened that no one expected. The war moved inside the gangs themselves. Brothers turned enemies. The gangs had always been enemies. 13 and Barrio 18 spilling blood over every block in El Salvador. But inside CECOT, during the riot, they had stood together. That unity didn't last. After the crackdown, old rivalries returned. Whispered insults turned into open threats. Leaders from both sides tried to keep order, but the prison was too crowded, the tension too sharp. One night, guards heard it, screams echoing from a cell block. When they rushed in, they found a man collapsed, blood dripping from wounds carved into his skin. His attackers were from the rival gang, locked in the same cell. CECOT had forced enemies into the same cages. And now it was reaping the chaos. The government wanted total control, but by mixing gangs together, it had created a battlefield inside the walls. The guards tightened security yet again, but it was useless. Every day, small fights broke out, shouts, fists, blood. The walls couldn't stop hatred that had been burning for decades. And then came the day when hatred turned into something worse, a coordinated attack not on the guards, but on each other. The prison war. It began at dawn. A single scream from one block. Then another. Then another. By the time guards reached the corridor, chaos had erupted. Rival gangs clashed inside their cells, fists and chains slamming into bodies, men slamming each other against steel bars. It was a war inside a war. The guards tried to break it up, but the sheer violence was overwhelming. Men were dragged out half-conscious, others drenched in blood, some refusing to stop fighting even as they were beaten with batons. CECOT had been built to crush the gangs. Instead, it had become the stage for their last battle. When the dust settled, dozens were injured. Some didn't survive. The outside world saw the headlines, CECOT under control. But those inside knew the truth. The gangs weren't finished. They weren't broken. They were evolving. And the prison itself was caught in the middle of a storm it had created. Isolation of the damned. The government's response to the prison war was merciless. If CECOT had once been called the world's highest security prison, now it became something even darker, a place of complete human isolation. Cells were locked tighter. Yard time was permanently erased. Prisoners were forced to eat, sleep, and exist in total confinement, chained like shadows behind steel. Guards no longer spoke to the inmates unless it was to bark an order. Every corner was stripped of humanity. Toilets were holes. Beds were bare slabs of concrete. The men became numbers, erased from the world beyond the walls. And yet, despite everything, the gangs still found ways to resist. Cymbals scratched into the floor. Songs whispered through the air vents. Even in the deepest silence, their presence refused to die. CECOT had become a nightmare, a place where neither guards nor inmates felt safe, a place where control and rebellion lived side by side in an endless, brutal dance. The truth of CECOT. On the outside, the story was simple. Crime dropped to historic lows. Families walked the streets again without fear. The government declared victory, and images of tattooed men chained in silence became symbols of power. But on the inside, the truth was far more complicated. CECOT was not just a prison. It was a machine designed to strip away identity, crush pride, and cage thousands of the world's most dangerous men in one place. Yet history shows that when you press too hard, when you squeeze too tight, the pressure never disappears. It builds. It waits. It transforms. The gangs had ruled the streets for decades. Now they were buried alive in concrete. But buried things, under enough pressure, can either be destroyed or explode back to the surface stronger than ever. The final question. CECOT is called the world's highest security prison. The government claims it has ended the terror of gangs once and for all. To many, it's a miracle. To others, it's a ticking time bomb. Behind those steel doors, in cells without light, thousands of men, the most feared, the most violent, the most dangerous, wait. Some are broken. Some are plotting. All of them are trapped in a place that feels less like a prison and more like a living tomb. And so, the question remains, has El Salvador truly defeated its demons? Or has it simply locked them away, waiting for the day the concrete walls of CECOT are tested again? Because if there is one truth about prisons, it is this: no wall is high enough, no cell is deep enough, to contain the darkness of human rage forever. CECOT may hold the most evil men alive, but sometimes, the scariest prison of all is the one that still lives inside them.